TransAtlantic Productions is proud to kick off Black History Month 2026 with the life story of Dr. Charles Sumner Finch III. To continue our founder's mission, ancestor Clemson Brown in recording great moments, proposals, articles, and history of our current and past contributors to our freedom movement in the United States and in the diaspora. Charles Sumner Finch III, physician, historian, and devoted family man, was born on February 25, 1948, in Topeka, Kansas, to Dr. Charles Finch, Jr. and Louise Hughes Finch. At the time of Charles's birth, his father was an officer in the United States Army, completing his psychiatric residency at the Menninger Clinic. Charles was the second of 7 children, and from early on, his gifts for leadership, scholarship, and excellence were unmistakable. As a young man, Charles excelled both in the classroom and on the field. In junior high and the first year of high school, he was a star football and basketball player, and his ability to lead set him apart. He became an Eagle Scout at the young age of 14 and was elected student council president in junior high school at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and again in his sophomore year of high school in Atascadero, California, a reflection of the confidence others placed in his character and vision. A turning point in his life came when he was accepted to the elite Commonwealth School in Boston, Massachusetts, for his junior year of high school. There he found a mentor in headmaster Charles Merrill, a relationship that grew into a lifelong friendship and helped shape the trajectory of his academic and personal journey. Charles Merrill was known as a philanthropist supporting black colleges. Following Commonwealth, Charles attended Yale University, where he majored in history and joined the prestigious Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. He remained deeply connected to his fraternity brothers throughout his life, valuing those bonds as a source of brotherhood, loyalty, and joy. After college, he returned to Commonwealth School as an instructor of African history and mathematics, bringing his sharp mind and commanding presence into the classroom. In February 1967, during their freshman year in college, Charles met Ellen Nixon, a student at Mount Holyoke, at a party at Yale. Their story became a true college sweetheart romance, and they married in 1972. Together, they built a remarkable life and became the proud parents of 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. Just 1 month after his wedding, Charles began medical school at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, launching a career that would include teaching, clinical work, and community leadership. Yet alongside his medical training, he undertook a personal intellectual undertaking that would define the rest of his life, a rigorous, all-consuming course of private study, as he often described it, creating a school in which he was both professor and pupil. This investigation spanned ancient African history, anthropology, comparative religion, and ancient science, pursued while he was a medical student and while he practiced as a board-certified physician. He was fond of saying that his real education did not begin until after he left college, a statement that captured both his humility and his relentless drive to learn. From 1979 to 1982, Dr. Finch served as a clinical preceptor at the Duke Watts Family Medicine Clinic in Durham, and he also worked as an investigative epidemiologist with the CDC in Raleigh. Charles received funding for the Raleigh Focus Project, where he introduced the community to Afrocentric scholars of the day. He was a leader in launching the celebration of Kwanzaa in the city of Raleigh. In 1982, he moved his family to Atlanta, where he worked as an assistant professor of community medicine and family practice at Morehouse School of Medicine. That year, his vocation and avocation powerfully converged when he authored the essay The African Background of Medical Science, published by I. von Sertima in the Journal of African Civilization. Over the next 16 years, 8 of his articles appeared in Van Sertima's anthologies, solidifying his standing as a leading voice in the exploration of Africa's deep intellectual and scientific heritage. That same year, Dr. Finch made his first journey to Africa, traveling to Senegal. the beginning of a lifelong commitment that would take him to the continent dozens of times. Driven by a profound interest in traditional African medicine, he joined the Office of International Health at Morehouse School of Medicine in 1989. In 1991, he served as principal investigator of a Knowledge, Attitudes, and Practices survey involving hundreds of Serer traditional healers in Senegal and their clientele. From then on, he continued to work with and learn from traditional healers across different regions of Africa, maintaining those relationships and that mission for the rest of his life. In August 1996, Dr. Finch was a co-organizer of Kumba Lamba, USA, an 8-day traditional healing ceremony from the Lebu Ndep tradition, brought to the United States for the first time at the Penn Center on St. Helena Island, South Carolina, an historic event reflecting his commitment to cultural integrity, community healing, and transatlantic connection. During this period, he also explored North American indigenous history and developed relationships with Native American healers in the continental U.S., Hawaii, and Alaska, inviting them to participate in Kumba Lamba, USA. Dr. Finch's scholarly contributions include major works that expanded understanding of Africa's ancient civilizations and their enduring impact on science, culture, and spirituality. His books include The African Background to Medical Science, 1990, Echoes of the Old Darkland, Themes from the African Eden, 1991, The Star of Deep Beginnings, Genesis of African Science and Technology, 1998. His fourth, and to many, greatest work, Nile Valley Civilization, A 10,000-Year History, 2023, and African Medicine, A Spirit Science Out of the Shadows, 2025. He served as Director of International Health at Morehouse School of Medicine until 2007, and he continued to explore, teach, and speak passionately on African history, culture, traditional medicine, and religion until his final day. A charismatic teacher and sought-after lecturer, Dr. Finch spoke across the world on his research and private study of ancient African civilizations. As an Egyptian scholar and historian, his accomplishments included serving as associate editor of the Journal of African Civilizations, co-founding and convening Newer Inc. of Atlanta, which sponsored the historic Nile Valley Conference held at Morehouse College, leading over 13 study tours to Kemet, Egypt, to introduce participants to the true story of Nile Valley civilization, and co-founding Kenti Inc. and the Kosan Foundation, which sponsored the historic Kumba Lamba USA ceremony in 1996. He was also a practitioner of the Benin Vodun spiritual tradition, known as Mamasi. Charles Sumner Finch III leaves to cherish his memory his beloved wife Ellen Finch, their 7 children, 3 brothers and 1 sister, 10 grandchildren, and a host of in-laws, nieces, nephews, and cousins, as well as countless students, colleagues, fraternity brothers, fellow scholars, and communities touched by his brilliance, generosity, and unwavering purpose. Dr. Finch received the President Obama Lifetime Achievement Award in 2017. His life was a testament to disciplined study, courageous inquiry, and the conviction that truth, especially truth long obscured, must be pursued and shared. His legacy lives on in his writings, his teachings, his family, and the many lives awakened by his voice. TransAtlantic Productions credits Phoenix Funeral Services Inc.com for the official obituary. We also thank the man photographers who followed Dr. Charles Finch's life in their art form. We at TransAtlantic Productions have in our archive many videos of Dr. Finch speaking in his own words with the passion and intellectual points only that Dr. Finch can bring. Dr. Finch is one of a very few African-American scholars who visited and worked with our great Dr. Diop in Senegal. Our founder, Clemson Brown, has at least a dozen videos of Dr. Charles Finch that we would like to share with the public, He has personally interviewed our great ancestor Dr. Finch, for he knew in his wisdom this own words would be priceless. If you would like to license our videos to do a program, please contact us.
I think you will agree that it was worth the wait. Brother Malachi, will you come forward? I'm John Chiselle from Baltimore and many generations back to our homeland, and I will be your moderator for the remainder of the conference in this room for the plenary sessions. I have been instructed by my two psychiatrist mentors to be both obsessive and compulsive about this time, but not to be stupid. So consequently, we delayed and we're off the schedule to give you this beautiful, inspiring opening ceremony. And I think you can understand why we wanted to start the conference out this way. We will be making adjustments so that we can finish today in a reasonable amount of time, allow everyone to get the food that they need, and to come to the elders session tonight on schedule. It's a difficult job, but the difficult takes a little longer, but it's not impossible. And since the spirits of our ancestors are here, it will be done. To formally open this following the ceremony, Brother Malachi Andrews will speak for himself and for Brother Richard King, who had to go to the airport to make sure that his sons got on the plane on time. Brother Andrews.
Hotel, brothers and sisters. The ancestors have spoke for me. The sounds of the brother, the permissions of the elders have spoken for me. I will only open the ceremony in respect of our president, Dr. Richard King, who had to leave in an emergency, and say a prayer for Dr. Ben Hakanen, who's not here but is here. And in behalf of all the Kimware Board Science Consortium, we welcome you here to the 4th Annual World Melanin Conference. Your spirit has generated a new energy and a new power for us to move on to the next millennium. Thanks for being here, and welcome. Hotel.
Hotel. Next, I have the very pleasant task of introducing our first plenary speaker for the conference. I knew of our speaker, Dr. Charles Finch, for years prior to meeting him, from reading his works and from observing and learning from him on the very special television program For the People. Suffice it to say, in terms of professional qualifications, that Dr. Finch is an MD and head of the Department of International Medicine at Morehouse Medical School. But what is more impressive to me is that he has immersed himself in the study of our ancient African history and people, to the extent that he went and was physically present at the side and at the feet of the Reverend Sheikh Anta Diop. And it was through Dr. Finch that I had the opportunity to meet perhaps Dr. Diop's outstanding disciple in the person of Theophile Mbenga. So I want to say publicly how grateful I am to Dr. Finch for what you brought me. He is therefore eminently qualified to give the first annual Sheikh Anta Diop lecture. And in the tradition of our ancient African healers, Dr. Finch has specialized in the history, the ancient African history of medical science, and the ancient African history of religions and philosophy, as did our ancient African ancestors, who were priests first and then physicians. So without further ado, welcome to our podium and our microphones, Dr. Charles Finch.
Thank you. Is this on and can you hear me? Because we've got important things to talk about today and I do want to be heard.
Okay, the power's on and the mic's on.
Just get that. Okay, that's a little better, I think. First of all, I want to say all power and all praise are due to the drums. The drums can heal and the drums can harm. The drums can raise you up to heaven and they can cast you down into hell. The drums can make you divine, or the drums can turn you into demons. So we know what the power and energy that has been generated from the drums can do. And again, I would say all power and praise are due to the drums. Now, in order to, we've got a lot to cover today. We've got a long journey to take. It is an odyssey, if you will, that is going to span about 65 million years. Now, some of you are aware of an article I wrote going on 5 years ago, which was entitled at that time, Race and Evolution in Prehistory. I was motivated to write that article after having, as was indicated, sat at the feet of Sheikh Anta Diop when he came to Atlanta, Georgia in the spring of 1985. It was then that Professor Diop was able to impress upon me in a way that I had never really fully appreciated before how important the study of what we call prehistory is in the overall context of what Black and African people have contributed to human development and world history. That is to say, there was a war, if you will, a battle being waged, and a battle of words, a battle of ideas being waged that was still trying to compromise in ways that were subtle, in ways that were often hidden from view, simply because, as was true and is still true to a certain extent, that when the stereotypical notion that if you want to hide something from Black people, you put it in print. The idea being, and I imagine that this is changing, I think it is changing. The fact that I can be here standing in front of you indicates to me that it is changing, that there are many ways of waging a war of oppression. It isn't just a matter of physical violence. As I think you are very well aware, it is a matter also of, shall we say, distortion of ideas. And perhaps that is the profoundest type of war that can be waged. You can always replace physical bodies, but to replace the collective mind of a people is an entirely different operation altogether. That doesn't call for replacement, that calls for resurrection. And that, of course, is a much more fundamental sort of operation. All that being said, it was Professor Shekanta Diop who showed me how absolutely essential it was to at least become conversant with the language of paleoanthropology and population genetics as a way of understanding exactly what the issues were and what was in the war that was being fought. Since that time, I have continued in that mission, if you will, or I have continued that mandate. And what strikes me as I go back from time to time and read that article in a way is how crude it was, how fundamental, how crude, how naive that article was. And I have often found that everyone has to be his or her own worst critic. And so there are actually parts of that article that embarrass me now, simply because of my lack of preparation, my ignorance, my sort of basic grounding at that time. But we all live and we all learn. So I have come a certain way since then, and it is this that I wish to discuss with you, is, if you will, in some way bring us up to date as to what is happening in this field and what it portends now and for the future. Because make no mistake, in spite of the overwhelming scientific and empirical evidence, there is still massive counterattacks that are being waged by various segments of the scientific community against the idea that humanity began in Africa. As preposterous as this might sound, there is a tremendous amount of scientific weight that is being waged or being brought to bear against this very issue. Okay, we will get to that in a minute. Now let's again begin our long journey on this odyssey that we are going to go into. And as I say, it begins about 65 million to 80 million years ago. At that time, all the continents were one. There were not the separate continents that we look at today and we take for granted today. All of the land mass of the Earth was essentially one great big supercontinent. At that time lived a mammalian species called the prosimians. The dinosaurs had probably been extinct for about 20 million years. The mammalian order of the animal kingdom had appeared and emerged and come to dominate the Earth. And a particular order of mammalians called the prosimians also had made their appearance. Now let me just say something parenthetically, and I always have to do this so that people understand exactly what I mean, where I'm coming from, because I don't always assume that everyone operates from the same premise that I do. This is not going to be a discussion of creationism. I'm not going to comment one way or the other about the scientific or intellectual validity of creationism, but this is not going to be a discussion about that. I root what I'm going to say very firmly in the idea of natural evolution. The only, from my point of view, scientifically defensible position to take. I am surprised, however, at how many people are actually recoil from the idea that human beings are related to animals, or related to the animal kingdom. And yet we know Africa then and now very clearly understood its relationship to what they call the lower orders of the animal kingdom. They clearly understood that they came out of the matrix of nature. They clearly show this in their iconography, in their mythology, in their symbols, where their highest deities were made to be represented in animal forms, because those animal forms represented literally the powers of God, not the least of which was Thoth, whose many, many images, one of whose many images was in fact the cynocephalic ape, the symbol and the master of speech, mind, will, and intelligence. So once you look very closely at African thought, the African worldview, African lore, you see that it is intrinsic, if you will, to an African way of thinking to assume or presume that human beings came out of a natural matrix and that there is, in fact, a kinship, a deep and abiding kinship between humans and the rest of nature, all living things. So therefore, if you look at it in that context, it shouldn't be strange, therefore, that we emerge in an evolutionary process out of the primates, out of the primate order, of which the apes were, prior to humans, the highest evolutionary form. Okay, so having editorialized in that fashion, let us get back to the main, so that we understand exactly the basis upon which we are talking, and then therefore we don't need to get sidetracked off onto what I consider irrelevant kinds of discussions. 65 million years ago, the large land masses of the Earth began to break up, and eventually forming what we call the continents of today. With 45 million years ago, there had appeared on both sides of what is now what we call the Atlantic Ocean and what is now South America and Africa, the monkey species, or the monkey order of primates, the monkey family, I should say, of the primate order. Now, we have a lot of different ways of looking at this, where the monkeys actually descended from prosimians who were in North America and that they evolved separately in South America and Africa, or did the South African monkeys actually in some way make the ocean voyage from Africa to South America? These are very critical issues which have not been resolved, but the reason why they are important because, again, we have to get a handle on, in looking at these questions, at just what happened where and in what sequence. And I might add, by the way, that the preponderant evidence, or the best evidence, suggests that the New World monkeys were in fact originated in Africa and got over there in some fashion that actually allowed them to transcend the Atlantic barrier. For one thing, North America and South America were not connected then. They didn't connect until about 4 million years ago. The distance between Africa and South America would have been much smaller than it is today. Not only that, but the seas would have been shallower. Still, there are problems with any interpretation. So we have two lines of thought. Either the New World monkeys derive from prosimians in North America, or they are representatives or late descendants or descendants of monkeys which originated in Africa, or what we call the Old World. This began about 45 million years ago. And the reason why we emphasize this is because this is the line that eventually leads to the apes, eventually leads to hominids, and of course to human beings today. And I think there is some value of understanding this process in its total time scale, in time and space, in order to get to understand that these things just don't happen in aliquots of tens of thousands of years or millions of years, but 20, 30, 40, 60 million years is what you need to begin to get a handle on what happened in this evolutionary process. Now, you have to understand also the world at this time. From about 45 million years when the monkeys first make their appearance to about 18 million years ago, the world was a much warmer and wetter place than it is today, which is to say that it was basically covered by large expanses of jungle, large expanses of forest that girdle essentially all the land masses of the globe, which is the reason why the primates, whether they be prosimians, and by the way, descendants of prosimians today would be animals like the lemurs and tarsiers in Madagascar. They are probably the latest or the only representation of the old prosimians that we have today. They in turn gave rise to the monkeys, evolutionary speaking, about 45 million years ago, became a very successful primate family. And the primate family is characterized by a number of characteristics. First of all, stereoscopic vision, because the two eyes are in front of the face instead of on the sides. Well-developed appendages, particularly what we call the hands and even the feet, and a long tail to allow them to live in an arboreal environment. That is, a tree or forested environment in the canopy of the upper canopy of the forest. This was absolutely, well, this is what they were adapted to. Because the world at that time was completely covered with forests, it made sense from an evolutionary point of view, and it made them very successful. It also meant that their masticatory patterns and their dietary patterns would have been necessity leaves, vegetables, fruits. That is what's up there. That's what they would have had to adapt to. And in fact, their dental morphology, their teeth, the way their teeth are shaped in terms of flat molars, very poorly developed canines, or I should say modified canines, are adapted. In fact, the shape of the jaw is adapted to basically a vegetarian eating environment and vegetarian eating patterns, which is to say, our own jaw shape, dental morphology is also an adaptation which we have retained from those evolutionary patterns 25, 30, 40 million years ago. Is that basically we have the dentition of a vegetarian eaters. Even though we eat meat, that is not the way, that is not really what our dental morphology is best suited for at this time. Okay, the monkey family of primates also became very successful, proliferating rapidly all over the land masses of the world, which were girdled by these vast forests on both sides of what was the water barrier between Africa and the New World, or Western Hemisphere, and by 25 million years had given rise to the process of evolution of the ape family. This occurred in one place only, the Old World, Africa in particular. This meant that since this was eventually going to give rise to hominids, that the New World, or the Western Hemisphere, no longer figured in the process of human evolution. So we can just take it out of the picture for the rest of our discussion, because there were no apes then or now that were there naturally in the New World or in the Western Hemisphere, and so human evolution, such as it occurs, or hominid evolution, is confined entirely to what we call the Old World, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, they appear, or make their first appearance, about 25 million years BC, or BCE, or BP, I should say. BP meaning before present being 1950, 25 million years before the present era. Now, they too were very successful. They too were very well adapted to an arboreal, that is, tree environment or forested environment, the upper canopy of the worldwide forest in this hot, warm, muggy climate that girdled the entire globe. They were bigger than monkeys, probably stronger than the monkeys, maybe not quite so agile. Their facial and head morphology was different. They were certainly more intelligent. They probably had they did have, in fact, greater brain capacity, so they did represent, if you will, an evolutionary advance from the monkeys. They too were very, very successful from 25 million years BP to 18 million years BP in this forested environment of the world. There were a dozen or more of them that evolved out of their monkey ancestors, and again, they were extremely successful, living in the upper canopy of the forest. In fact, some people have called this, quote, the age of the ape, if you will, because they were numerous, they were ubiquitous, they were widely dispersed, and they were obviously very successful. Okay. But something happened beginning about 18 million years before the present. And this sort of is what I'm about to describe is the inherent drama of evolution. The only thing that doesn't change, particularly when you're looking at the life cycle of all living things on this planet, is change itself. Evolution is about change. And the environment, of course, is constantly changing. The environment is constantly undergoing modifications and change. And if a living species, be it plant or animal, is to survive these changes that are occurring in the environment, it too has to respond. It has to react to changes that occur in the environment. I call this the call and response pattern of evolution. Nature or the environment undergoes certain kinds of intrinsic changes, whether it be climatic changes, whether it be eruptions of land masses into mountains, whether it be earthquakes, whether it be any kind of change you can imagine. Nature calls, if you will, to living organisms through its own changes. The species, whether it be plant or animal, if it is to survive, let alone be perpetuated, has to, if you will, respond to these changes in the environment. Respond successfully, and this is what we call adaptation. Modify itself as a species in order to take advantage of or meet the new challenges imposed by nature herself. So, as I say, this is a call and response pattern of evolution. Those who do that successfully go on and have their gene pools perpetuated. Those who don't, as we know, basically die off. They become evolutionary dead ends. And this has happened hundreds, thousands, even millions of times in the history of biological evolution on this planet. Well, something happened around 18 million years ago, which is going to have tremendous implications or tremendous impact on particularly the ape branch of the primate order. The world began to dry out, literally. There was a drying effect which began to shrink the girdle of forest which covered the entire globe. This is a change in nature that I have described, which created a new challenge for the apes, these dozens of apes that were living in the forest canopy. What did it do? First of all, it constricted food supply because all their food were coming from the forest canopy, fruits, leaves, vegetables. It also constricted their living space, as you can imagine. They would have been somewhat less adaptable than the monkeys to this particular situation because they were bigger. They had greater caloric requirements, if you will. So less mobile, less agile, bigger, greater caloric requirements meant that the shrinking of the forested areas was going to have a much greater impact on them than it would the monkeys. So, in particular, it's interesting now also look what happened in terms of geographic location. This drying of the earth, and therefore the shrinking of the forest, seem to select or be specific in certain parts of the globe, particularly Africa. What we find in Southeast Asia mainly is that there wasn't nearly so much drying, and that the dense jungle itself maintained itself there in Southeast Asia in particular. In Africa, however, this drying process, beginning about 18 million years ago, began to create environmental mosaics. What do I mean by that? It meant that patches of forest and woodland began to be interspersed with dry savanna or grassland. Now, this is absolutely crucial for human evolution, as we shall see. And this is absolutely crucial, and it will make all the difference in the world as far as human evolution is concerned. For the apes in Africa, it meant that a new kind of response was called for. And literally, those, not just in Africa, but all over the world, it meant that if any of them were going to survive, they would have to literally come down out of the trees. And this is, in fact, what happened, at least for some of them. They began, in terms of accumulated behavior over a period of millions of years, began to move down out of the trees onto the ground where, of course, they would have greater food sources and resources to exploit. They would have greater living spaces, and so therefore they would, in other words, compensate for the restricted living space and food sources in these shrinking forests by coming down on the ground and maximizing their range of food, procuring a range of food foraging, and also their living space. This was absolutely decisive, actually, because out of the dozen or more ape species that existed some 20 million years ago, only 4 have survived, 2 in Africa and 2 in Asia. The 2 in Africa are the chimpanzee and gorilla. In Asia is the gibbon and the orangutan. The gibbon and the orangutan. And what is interesting is that 3 out of these 4 ape species that have survived are ground dwellers to a greater or lesser degree. Even the orangutan in East Asia, who spent probably most of its time in the forest or in the trees, when it has to travel, comes down on the ground to do so. So it, too, is at least partially a ground dweller. What you find among the gorillas and the chimpanzees is that they are predominantly ground dwellers, although not exclusively. So that what we find out is that those apes who had at least partially adapted to a ground-dwelling environment are the ones that survived this change in environment beginning 18 million years ago. Now, therefore, as I say, that was crucial. However, every opportunity presents a new challenge. Every response presents a new threat, if you will. What happens, of course, when you move out of the rather safe haven of the trees and onto the ground is all of a sudden you are susceptible or you are vulnerable to predation in the way that you're not up in the trees. The trees are kind of a haven or kind of a sanctuary against predators for the most part. Now you're on the ground and you become, if you will, fair game, literally speaking, for predators, particularly the big cat. So how do these apes, as they move down out of the trees into the ground-dwelling environment, how do they deal with this new challenge? Every opportunity creates a challenge. Well, they have to develop or intensify their social relationships. They have to become very social. They have to become social organizations, social groupings, troops, if you will, organized troops, because in that way they can maximize their possibilities of fending off attacks from predators, particularly the big cats. And this is in fact what happens. So even though there are other animals or other animals in the animal kingdom who live in societies, what you find among these apes is that they had to develop a well-ordered, highly structured, well-organized communal living pattern as a way of protecting themselves against the threats from the predators in the environment, so that they could have individuals who are designated to look out while others are feeding, that they could close ranks against a predator in case of attack. And what we find now among gorillas and chimpanzees is that, relatively speaking, they are fairly impervious to predators at this point. very little predation pressure on chimpanzees and or gorillas at this time. In fact, chimpanzees are so bold now, some of them actually confront and drive off leopards individually. So this was an absolute necessity. This increased social organization was dictated by the necessity to move to the ground in the first place in order to maximize their eating and living resources. So you can see that there is, if you will, a chain of causal links that sort of fuel, if you will, or sort of drive this evolutionary process. There's a feedback loop, if you will, that shape and construct and link all of the different types of events and sequences together in a kind of seamless continuum of evolution. So here we find groups of ape species who had more or less successfully made a transition to at least a partially ground-dwelling environment, sometime between 18 million and 8 million or 7 million BC, or before the present. They didn't abandon the trees or the forest altogether. They could retire to the forest during the heat of the day to protect against the sun, and at night they could still climb up into the trees, which many of them did to protect them against predators. So they are not completely, if you will, independent independent of the forest or the forested environment. However, there is a small group of apes, if you will, who began to be more adventuresome, who began to look beyond the narrow confines of the forests and woodlands out into the open savanna for, again, food sources and living space. They began to venture further and further into the savanna, into the open spaces of East Africa. Now, again, what this does, it gives them advantage because it maximizes or improves or increases their food resources and their living space. But again, the same challenges apply. They are more vulnerable out in the living open spaces, not just from predators. Now they are vulnerable to the equatorial sun itself. As you know, chimpanzees and gorillas have fur, or they have coats of fur that are dark brown or black. They can repair to the shade of trees in the heat of the day, so they are not, if you will, subjected to the potentially devastating effects of solar irradiation. But another problem arises among the subgroup who moves out of the savanna. Now they have a problem of heat dissipation. What does fur do to the body? Fur retains heat, does it not? Now they're out further, they're out into the savanna, they're out into the open land, they are being subjected to direct solar irradiation for hours and hours at a time. I'm talking about an accumulated pattern of behavior, a pattern of experience. So how, from an evolutionary point of view, do they react or respond to this new challenge? They have an opportunity, but they have a challenge too. The challenge now is solar irradiation. Well, one of the things they have to do, of course, is they have to lose their bodily hair. They lose their bodily hair in order to maximize the loss of heat from the body. The other thing they do is proliferate sweat glands. The most efficient and effective way that the efficient and effective way you have of losing heat from the body is by evaporation of water. So you proliferate sweat glands on an increasingly hairless body, and the evaporation of sweat carries away heat. In fact, evaporation of sweat can carry away 10 times the amount of heat that's actually produced by the body. So you lose your bodily hair in order to promote this heat loss, and you proliferate sweat glands in order to promote the evaporation of heat, or the carrying away of heat by evaporation of sweat. So this is one of the things that happens. Of course, now this is a important, shall we say, adjustment or modification or adaptation to this new circumstance. But again, you have another problem. Prior to that time, your hair and your fur as an ape have been protecting you against solar irradiation and its devastating consequences. Now you're losing your hair, you're losing your bodily fur, and the underlying skin is potentially susceptible, is essentially potentially vulnerable to the ultraviolet rays of the sun. What do you do? Or not what do you do, what happens if you are going to survive in this new mode? Well, dark skin, dark fur, or dark hair, of course, is caused by melanin production. So the melanin production in the fur is now transferred to the skin. Has to happen. Can't happen any other way, not if this new subgroup of primates is moving out into the savanna. Because what does melanin do from the point of view of dermal melanin? It protects against the carcinogenic rays of ultraviolet light. That is to say, albinos in Africa do not live very long. They seldom live much into their third decade because they develop gross, disfiguring, morbid skin cancers, which bring a otherwise distressing life to a very premature close. So if this new group who is moving out in the savanna and losing its hair and proliferating its sweat glands is going to survive, it has to develop melanin-producing capability in the skin, because melanin absorbs the ultraviolet light and disperses the free radicals and therefore prevents skin cancer from developing. This absolutely had to happen. There is one of the things that is true about evolution is that there is a rigorous logic to it. It couldn't have been any other way. So that these first these first groups that have moved away from the ape into a new evolutionary stage, which we call the hominids, by definition would have been black skin. Now, there's also something called Glogger's law, which we will come back a little bit later on. Glogger's law says two things. Glogger's law says, when you're talking about warm-blooded mammals, the closer you get to the Arctic Circle, the whiter their coat. The examples would be snowshoe rabbits, Arctic foxes, and polar bears. The closer you get to the equator, the darker your coat as warm-blooded mammals. And sure enough, you look at the chimpanzees, you look at the gorillas, and they have black or dark brown hairy coats. And so you can see that this also conforms to Glogger's law. Now, these new types of primates emerged about 4 million years BCE, or 4 million years before our era. They seem to have diverged from the chimpanzee about 7 million years ago. One of the things that molecular biology has taught us, comparative molecular biology, is that human beings and chimpanzees, from the point of view of genetics, are 98% alike. We are only different in 2% of our genes. Now, this 2% is enough to create fairly substantial differences in phenotype that mark the chimpanzee and the human, but if you go to the genetic level, we find that we are actually closer than we are different. We are 98% the same. In fact, chimpanzees and human beings are closer to each other than either is to the orangutan, for example. I might add, too, interestingly enough, is that the really intensely social primates, apes, you see mainly in Africa, chimpanzees and gorillas. The orangutan and the gibbon are solitary apes. Why? Because they are still in a forested jungle environment. The same kind of pressures that develop the sort of social context of chimpanzees and gorillas that ultimately lead to human evolution are just not present in East Asia. The other thing that is important to understand, the real dynamic between human evolution in terms of its environmental determinants is this interaction, this dynamic relationship between forest and savanna. The kind of interaction, the yin and the yang between the forest and the savanna, the moving in and out, further out and then back in, further out and back in. This kind of dynamic continuum between forest and savanna is what, again, helps drive human evolution. You do not have that mosaic creating that kind of tension anywhere else in the world. So you can begin to see why, from the point of view of nature and the point of view of natural logic, it couldn't have happened anywhere else. It had to have that kind of, shall we say, dynamic ecological tension that you see in East Africa in particular. So this is why it occurred in East Africa, as the fossil evidence shows us unequivocally. So the hominid meaning human-like or man-like, diverged from the chimpanzee about 7 million years ago. 6 to 7 million years ago, and had appeared as a distinct species, different from the ape, and, if you will, more evolutionarily advanced than the ape, somewhere between 4 and 5 million years ago. And so it is between 4 and 5 million years ago that the hominid first makes its appearance on the African landscape in East Africa. So here we have, up to now, covered about, 60 million years in the space of about 25 minutes. And we haven't even gotten warm yet. Now, the type specimen of the first hominid is called Australopithecus afarensis, found in southern Ethiopia in the Afar Triangle by Donald Johansen, who gave her, because it was a her, named Lucy. 3.5 million years old, but pretty good evidence that the Australopithecus afarensis had appeared at least from 4 million years BCE. So we are on safe ground in saying that the specific hominid or humanoid line of evolution first makes its appearance in Africa, in East Africa, 4 million years ago, perhaps as early as 5 million years ago. This hominid was upright walker, walking on 2 legs and 2 feet instead of knuckle walking like chimpanzees and gorillas do. She walked as well as we do today. She was pretty much bereft of her bodily hair, although she was still a little hairier than we might be today, but still bereft of her bodily hair. She had a cranial capacity of about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, and by definition, she would have had to have been black or dark brown of skin. Couldn't have been any other way. As I said, as I like to say, without this relatively simple biological, biochemical adaptation, without the melanin content of the skin, human evolution would have been stillborn even before it began. So you could not even there would be no human beings today without this original melanin content in the first hominids 4 million years ago. That hominid, again, emerges in East Africa or the eastern side of Africa because there is evidence of Australopithecus afarensis down into Tanzania and even into South Africa, gives rise to a number of different lines of evolution. There are other members of her genus, shall we say, Australopithecus that emerge, Australopithecus afarensis. There is Australopithecus robustus. Then there are Australopithecus boisei. All of these represent further evolutions along the Australopithecine line of descent. They eventually turn out to be a dead end and disappear altogether by 1 million BCE. However, there is another line of descent from the original Australopithecus afarensis. That is Homo habilis. Homo habilis emerges in Kenya and Tanzania, or thereabouts, somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million years ago. Again, small in stature, upright walking, black or dark brown of skin, with a cranial capacity that is probably about 700 to 750 cubic centimeters, representing a quantum increase or quantum improvement in the cranial capacity and therefore the intelligence of Australopithecus afarensis, and therefore obviously an evolutionary advance. They seem to share the same habitat in Africa, East Africa, until about 1 million to 1.5 million years BCE, when Homo erectus makes its appearance on the East African landscape. Homo erectus is very close to modern human beings. Homo erectus, again, a little bit taller, maybe as tall as 5.5 feet, dark or black of skin, upright, also tool users and fire makers. Australopithecus does not make tools. Homo makes tools. Homo habilis makes tools. That's the reason why we call him Homo habilis, handyman or man with ability, because he is a tool maker instead of just a tool user. Chimpanzees use sticks and rocks as tools, but they do not make tools. Tool maker is Homo. Homo habilis the first, his successor, Homo erectus, an even more skilled tool maker and probably the first fire builder. Not that inferior to modern human beings in intelligence because his cranial capacity goes up to 1,200 cubic centimeters. 1,200 cubic centimeters is a lower limit of normal for modern human beings. What is also interesting is that until Homo erectus makes his appearance 1 to 1.5 million years ago, none of the hominids leave Africa. Now, some people have tried to say that this is entirely fortuitous. No, they have looked. They have looked in Asia and in Europe in the same geological strata that they have found Australopithecus in and Homo habilis in, and they absolutely have yielded animal fossils, plant fossils, but they have not yielded any hominids whatsoever. So up until Homo erectus, all of human evolution occurs in Africa and Africa alone. There are no human types outside Africa. There are human ancestors outside Africa. Homo erectus is the first migrant out of Africa. Appearing between 1 million and 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus in small bands goes into Europe and goes into Asia. Java man and Peking man are examples of his type. He gives rise about 250, he disappears about 300 to 250,000 years ago, and then emerges Homo sapiens sapiens, that is modern human beings, again in East Africa. Also, Neanderthal, but Neanderthal is a side branch of evolution and ultimately becomes a dead end, has nothing to do with Homo sapiens sapiens evolution. So Homo sapiens, modern human beings, all of us in this room, all 5.5 billion of us on this planet, appears first somewhere about 200,000 years ago in East Africa. So as C.A. Aremburg says, in Africa alone, is where you can find in the fossil record an unbroken sequence of human evolution from the first type 4 million years ago all the way up to the advanced and latest type Homo sapiens sapiens. So this is the reason why, if you're talking about an anthropological Garden of Eden, it is Africa and it cannot be anywhere else. You would be surprised, in spite of the irrefutable fossil evidence, there are still large segments of the scientific community who are trying to dispute this, but more of that later. Now, Homo sapiens sapiens emerges in Africa, again, somewhat diminutive, head size or cranial capacity between 1,200 cubic centimeters and 2,000 cubic centimeters, average 1,500 cubic centimeters. Obviously a culture maker, fire builder, innovator, obviously dark brown or black of skin by definitions for the same reasons that we have mentioned already. There is fossil evidence of Homo sapiens sapiens 130,000 and 440,000 years old in 4 different places in East Africa. In Omo Kibish in Kenya, also in Klasis River's mouth in South Africa, and 2 other places, evidence of fossils of Homo sapiens sapiens, modern human beings in Africa, at least 130 to 140,000 years old. There are no fossils of that age of Homo sapiens sapiens anywhere else in the world. Now, Homo sapiens sapiens also, probably about 100,000 years ago, begins to also migrate out of Africa. We know that this occurred at least then because of the oldest non-African Homo sapiens sapiens fossil was found in Israel about 3 or 4 years ago and is dated at 92,000 years ago. So this would be the first leg on the step toward Homo sapiens dispersions throughout the world. Let us now come to some of the biomolecular evidence that bear on this question. The best of it comes from the work of a group of Berkeley molecular biologists led by Rebecca Cann and Alan Wilson with mitochondrial DNA. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but let's talk about it anyway, because this is very, very important in the context of our discussion. There are 2 types of DNA in the human cell. There's nuclear DNA, which is double-stranded, and mitochondrial DNA, which is single-stranded. The reason why nuclear DNA is double-stranded because it comes from both parents. It comes from mother and father. And then when you marry your spouse, your DNA together will give it double-strandedly to your children. Mitochondrial DNA is different. Mitochondrial DNA is in the power plant of the cell, which is the mitochondrion. It is single-stranded. Why? Because it comes from the mother and the mother alone. Why does this happen? Because when, at the point of fertilization, the mitochondrial DNA in the sperm disintegrates. And so all the mitochondrial DNA that you have now in your genome or in your mitochondria comes from the female and from the female alone. Well, this has some very interesting properties. It means that we can trace back through mitochondrial DNA studies through the female line, because it's not double-stranded, so they do not recombine, they do not exchange genetic information, so it is relatively clean and relatively simple. Another thing that we have that is pretty well established, mitochondrial DNA, sum up, huh? That's a little ambitious. Let's just keep going, and then I think I'm going to have to take 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes. I'm going to sort of take 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes, and then I can sum up. I know I've got only 3, but I'm going to take 10. Because we got to get all this in context. Now, so pardon me for my liberties, but we'll make it up to you. Mitochondrial DNA is single-stranded, so it does not exchange. Also, the mutation rate is 2 to 4% per million years. That's number 1. Therefore, it is possible to detect the mutational prints in mitochondrial DNA. Therefore, if you can count the number of mutational prints, you can get a sense of how old the DNA is, right? The mitochondrial DNA. The longer the DNA has been around, the more mutations it would be subject to. So if you have more mutations, that is the oldest DNA. So what Can did was take mitochondrial DNA from 125 different subjects from 5 different racial groups. Essentially what she did, she counted everybody's mutational record on their DNA and found out the most varied DNA came, one, from blacks, and most varied from the people we call the Bushmen, or the Khoisan people. She therefore said that she was, and also she was able, because we know of the mutation rate of 2 to 4% per million years, to be able to pinpoint more or less when the first ancestor would have arisen to give us all of our mitochondrial DNA. So she was able to conclude that the first identifiable female ancestor of the entire human race, all 5.5 billion of us, was a woman of the Khoisan type who lived in East Africa some 200,000 years ago. Everybody in this planet, no matter what race, is descended from that woman. And she lived in Africa 200,000 years. As some of my Spelman students like to say, in the beginning was woman, and she was African. That just happens to be the truth. That just happens to be the truth. That happens to be the scientific truth. So that here we have the first identifiable female ancestor of all of the planet, who was given the name Eve, lived in East Africa some 200,000 years ago, and this is consistent with the fossil record. So in this case, the biomolecular evidence and the fossil records interdigitate and confirm and support one another. Okay, now let's get into this business of the development and evolution of races. I don't have to spend much time on it. About 50,000, first of all, you have to understand about, you have to understand a little bit about the glaciers, the Ice Age. The Ice Age began about 2 million years ago, and there was ice ages, there was kind of ebb and flow of the ice ages in stages over 2 million years. The last one...
Hold it right there, we're going to turn the tape over.
Okay.
So this will give the AV people a chance to turn your tapes over.
The last glaciation was the Worm Glacial. And even within the, which began about, let me think, sorry, began about 80,000 years ago. Now, what happens in a glaciation is that vast sheets of ice, a mile thick, come down from the Arctic Circle, and they come down over Europe and North America, down about the level of the 51st parallel. In Africa and tropical areas, you find glaciers when the glacier ice age occurs only in the mountainous regions. Now, the last glaciation, if you will, had a let-up around 50,000 BC, which meant that Europe was temperate enough to allow habitation. Groups of people from Africa would have crossed over into Europe and inhabited most of the southern half or the southern 3/4 of Europe. And they would have been there about 40,000 years ago when there was a renewed onset of the Ice Age. Now, there were therefore 3 adaptive responses that were mandated by this. One is you could, of course, leave, which many of them probably did, or you could eat, or you could take in vitamin D. We haven't talked about vitamin D, but let's talk about it. The skin has several different functions as an organ. One of the things it does is produce vitamin D in the skin. It does that with by interaction with ultraviolet light. Now, that's absolutely necessary, otherwise your bones are going to all break up, and it's just, shall we say, from a point of view of adaptation, a tremendous disadvantage. Well, in Africa, the melanin in the skin screens out most of the ultraviolet light, but there's so much sunlight, so much of the time, that enough penetrates the melanin barrier for the needs of the skin to produce vitamin D. Not a problem. Different now when you go up into Europe, you're an African or an Africoid type, Khoisan type, dark skin, black skin, and all of a sudden there is a renewed sudden onset of the Ice Age. All of a sudden it's cold, overcast, very little sun, relatively speaking. The sun does not come at the angle, the sun does not come at a direct, but at a oblique angle, and so weakens its effect. And so now the black skin that you have is actually a liability. So you have 3 adaptive choices from the point of view of producing vitamin D. Leave, eat exogenous vitamin D from the diet, but there's only one place in which you can get exogenous natural vitamin D. Ocean-going fish, northern ocean-going fish and fish oils. But we're talking about a part of Europe 1,000 to 1,500 miles inland in southwestern Russia. So the only other adaptive choice literally is to lose your skin pigment. What does white skin do? Well, in Africa, it kills you, literally, because you cannot literally stand the sun. However, the situation is completely reversed in Europe, because you've lost your skin, you've lost your melanin, and what that allows is a 3 to 5 greater penetration of the sun, and you can extract ultraviolet light much greater and much more readily to produce vitamin D. And in fact, we know that this is in fact what happens, is that white skin produces vitamin D at a 3 to 5 greater efficiency rate than black skin. And also, white skin is also more cold resistant. We found this out in World War II when blacks were 3 to 5 times more likely to get frostbite than whites among the soldiers. So this white skin now has 2 adaptive advantages in this ice age environment. It allows greater production of vitamin D, and it is greater protection against the cold, frigid environment. So this would have been the other adaptive choice, and this would have had to have happened. Now, what would be the mechanism by which this happens? It's one thing to propose this, it's another reason to give it a plausible mechanism. You have to propose a mechanism that will allow the transmission of this characteristic of white skin to the daughter populations. The only thing that does that is a genetic mutation, and that is albinism. Albinism, the loss of the ability to make melanin, dermal melanin. Well, there are several types of albinism. The one that we want to concentrate on is albinoidism. It comes from something called tyrosinase positive albinism. It means that it is not a complete or total albinism. It is an incomplete albinism or albinoidism, which robs the skin of most of its color, but also gives ranges of hair color from blonde to brunette to red hair. Also, eye color can change from hazel to green to brown, and the various eye shades you find among Europeans. It is an albinism that exhibits what we call, 1, incomplete penetrance and variation of expression. So therefore, the skin retains a moderate or mild ability to tan. So it is not a total or absolute albinism, because we know that Europeans can in fact tan. So the only conclusion that you can come to as a result of all this is that those who survived the last glaciation beginning about 40,000 years ago must have been a group of albinoids who were cold adapted. Blacks are warm adapted. Albinoids are cold adapted, and therefore gradually, or not so gradually, replaced their darker skinned brethren who were living in the same area. This process may have been completed between 15 and 20,000 years. I might add one other thing about warm adaptation and the so-called Negroid, quote-unquote, facies or facial morphology. Remember we talked about the necessity to lose heat. Well, where do you lose most of your heat from? Mostly from your head. 85% of the heat loss comes from the head, which is why we have kinky hair, particularly peppercorn hair. What does it do? It exposes more of the scalp to the environment. You can lose heat better that way. Why do we tend to have thick lips? It increases the surface area of the face, improves heat loss. Why do we have broad flaring nostrils tendency? Why? Because it allows greater movement of air, and you have to understand you don't lose just moisture from the skin, you also lose moisture from the lungs. So all of these are heat adaptations to a hot environment. Absolute opposite in Europe. You have adaptations to a cold environment, an icy environment. White skin being the first and certainly the most distinctive aspect of that, which improves vitamin D utilization and cold resistance. But narrowed nose, what does it do? It warms inspired air. Thin lips, narrowed features, reduces the surface area of the face. Hair that lays down on the back of your shoulders, it retains heat on your head. So in other words, all of these adaptations are due to basically adaptation in a cold, icy, frigid environment. This process was completed probably no later than 25,000 years BCE. We'll spend two minutes on the Mongoloid. The Mongoloid underwent a similar adaptation. The Mongoloid would have been a group of Khoisan people who would have migrated into the steppes of Siberia and undergone a similar lightening of skin, but there you have 2 other things that are going on as well. The steppes of Siberia are windswept all the time. So one of the things you notice about the Khoisan is that they have these epicanthal folds. So this, they would now, by this time, they would have been spread all over the world, including Southeast Asia. During a period of relative warming, would have moved up into Siberia. At the onset of the renewed onset of the glacier period, they would have had the same and similar, shall we say, environmental pressures on them. But in addition, the epicanthal folds would have been accentuated in order to protect the eyes against the winds and also the warm air of the face. The stockiness of body that is characteristic of Orientals or Asiatics, again, what does that do? It retains heat, as does the straight hair. And as Shekhar suggested, is that there probably also was gene interchange across the two sides of Eurasia. From the west, the Caucasoid, from the east, the Mongoloid, would have modified one another by gene interchanges, although the Mongoloid continued to get gene infusions from the south all the way up to the historical period, as James Brunson has showed us. Okay, that brings us to 20,000 BC. And we have there, as I said, covered about 65 million years of human evolution in the space of about 55 minutes. But what this does, or what is important about this, is to, shall we say, give a long view of a perspective of what happened. That the humanity itself came out of the African soil by definition, and that all peoples, various races, are branches off of that trunk. This is not special pleading. It is not ideology. It is not my own particular preference as such. It just happens to be the way it happened as far as human evolution occurs. Period, end of statement. We don't need to say anything more. We don't need to get even. That is the reason why some of these things that are coming out today are really kind of pathetic, because the scientific, not only the molecular evidence, but also the skeletal evidence is very clear in this respect. So as far as what Shekhar calls an operative scientific principle, we can come to no other conclusion. Everyone, as one person says, basically we are all Africans under the skin, simply because everything, all humanity, came ultimately out of Africa. And that is the only conclusion at which we can come to. Having said that, let us now go to the slides, which we will take about 10 minutes to go through, and then we will entertain questions and answers. What it looked like. What is interesting is that there is a segment of northeast North America which actually is of the same geological constitution as West Africa. So I like to tell people all you have to do is go to Macon, Georgia if you want to be on African soil. This just shows you some of the trees that have been developed to account for the branches out of Australopithecus afarensis. This is Johansson's tree, Donald Johansson, showing the various Australopithecines up at top. Let me see, I've got a... These are various Australopithecines, and then Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens as another branch of the tree. These, of course, went into a dead end. There's another, because of another skull called the black skull, which shows an early robust type. They actually think now that there are 3 branches on the tree. That's Africanus, I think, and this is the robusts. The Africanus was different. The gracile, which we lightly built. The robusts were another branch, and then Homo was a 3rd branch. There's still arguments about that. This is Lucy, the skeleton of Lucy. Aside from her antiquity and her provenance means place of origin in southern Ethiopia, the reason why she's important is because of her age, 3.5 million years, and also that she's 40% complete. This is an artist's conception of what Lucy might have looked like. These are the footprints in the Lake Toli bed in Tanzania, which to me are some of the most remarkable things ever discovered. 3.75 million years. These footprints are 3.75 million years old in Tanzania. Actually, if you will, a snapshot of human movement that has been preserved for nearly 4 million years. To me, this is one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. As you would imagine, coming from Africa, discovered by Mary Leakey. What this shows you is that these people from 4 million years, or nearly so, had to have been walking upright. You can't get knuckle walkers giving you this kind of impression in the soil. Again, this is just an artist's conception of these people moving across the Tanzania, what we now call the Tanzanian landscape, nearly 4 million years ago. These are members, or artist's conception of the members of the Australopithecus afarensis species. The same, in other words, these would be the same species as Lucy. Shows them kind of on the ground, foraging, but also not too far from the trees. This is the Tong baby from South Africa, discovered by Raymond Dart, which really was the first discovery that placed Africa at the forefront of paleontology. And this was discovered in 1925. Now, these are artist representation of Australopithecus Australopithecus africanus, a later evolutionary side branch of afarensis. The reason why I like this particularly is it shows you the kind of environment they would have been living in. The trees, woodlands in the background, but largely out in the open in the savanna, digging for tubers, grubs, and eating off leaves and fruits. And this is how early human beings would have, or early human ancestors would have lived, and their habitat, what their habitat might have looked like. Just showing you the evolution of the various parts of the anatomy from, this is a, can't read that. This is a chimpanzee, man, you can see progressively upright, larger and higher skull, et cetera, change in the pelvic and lower leg morphology there as in an evolutionary sequence. Also, this is of the brain size. This is Australopithecus afarensis, 500 cubic centimeters. 1,000 is Homo erectus, and then modern human beings, 1,500 cubic centimeters. Just shows you a, shall we say, a kaleidoscope of heads, of skulls, again in Africa, showing you the evolution of the hominid skull all the way up to the human-like, to the modern human skull right here. And you see that the cranial morphology begins larger. This went out. Larger, and the forehead gets higher, and the brow ridges become more attenuated. These are actors who have been dressed up or made up to look like what Homo erectus would have looked like 1 million years ago. That's the reason why I like this. It kind of gives you a sense of what Homo erectus, who is very close to us in every respect, might have looked like. Homo erectus doesn't disappear really until about 250,000 years ago. Most of you have seen this, I'm sure. It is interesting. I picked this up, and then I went back 3 days later to get another copy, and there were none left anywhere in the city. You know, I don't know if our ancestors wore jerry curls or not. Nonetheless, this is how they are depicted here. This just shows you the genetic clues. You see the top, the nuclear DNA, which is double-stranded, the mitochondrial DNA, which is single-stranded, and the mitochondrial DNA has had the most impact on discussions of human evolution because, as I say, it's single-stranded and it doesn't recombine, and it's easy to look at its mutational prints. Our ancestors 200,000 years ago would have looked like this. Not all humanity's ancestors. These are people called the Bushmen, more properly called Khoisan or San people, now mainly confined to the Kalahari Desert and Namibia, or like this, people called, so-called pygmies, more properly called the Twa. These two are the modern representations. In other words, if you want to know what our ancestors might have looked like, these are the people you would have to look at today. This just shows you the three contending views of human evolution. We don't really have time to go into this. The monogenetic versus the polygenetic versus the multi-regional evolution. Perhaps we can discuss it more informally after this session. This just shows you the glaciation that occurred. What I suspect is that Caucasoid evolution occurred at the level of the 51st parallel. And what is interesting is that we know that the glacier came down to the 51st parallel, encompassing southern Russia, and then you look at, there are 3 Aurignacian sites of the so-called Hottentot Venuses that are right along the 51st parallel, and they're old, and they're 40,000 years old. To me, that is, again, indirect support of my contention. I'm sure those of you have seen this. It's quite clear from the hairstyle and the steatophagy on the buttocks, steatophagy meaning abnormal accumulation of fat on the buttocks, which is certainly an African, particularly a Southern African trait, that these are African women, black African women. And yet, as we know, these were found in Europe. These represent the first Europeans. The first Europeans were, the first European women would have looked like this, or at least their idea, obesity was idealized then, because it was a symbol of the maternal and fertility symbol. In other words, but these would be our first Europeans. And these, you can see a so-called Khoisan or Hottentot woman in the middle for comparison. And these and their African counterparts would have looked like that in the Sahara. This comes from the Sahara. Okay, these are the so-called Bushmen or Khoisan. I like to show this because some of the characteristics that I was talking about, the peppercorn hair, the brownish yellow complexion, and the so-called slanted eyes, if you will, to use that term, are, shall we say, precursors of the Mongoloid type. Even though they're only found in Africa today, there was a time when they would have been distributed all over the tropical areas of the world. And again, these are some Khoisan women. I think this is the Kalahari Desert. And again, I like that because of the peppercorn hair, which shows you the heat part of the heat adaptation that I was talking to you about. Now, you would think that this is a Khoisan woman from South Africa, so-called Bushman woman, color, hair texture, steatophagy, everything. Actually, she's an Andaman Islander off the coast of Malaysia and India. She is an Asian. She represents, as does this woman, the first Asians. This is where they came from. Look at the map in the upper right-hand corner. The Andaman Islands are just off the coast of Thailand. They belong to India. And you can see an Andaman Islander today. These represent the first inhabitants of Asia. Okay, let me go quickly. Khmer. This is Solomon Islands, Southeast Asia, South Pacific. This, I think, is New Guinea. I also want to show you New Guineans and Australians. Some of them have blonde and red hair, showing you again some of the precursors to those types of hair colors in what became the European. This is from Fiji, Philippines. This is a quote Negrito, unquote. This is Australia. Australia, again, look at that, very striking, the yellow hair. That's natural hair, that's natural blonde. They don't have to bleach themselves to get that. So even natural blonde hair is something that, appears among us first. This just shows you the route of migration. You find that the seas were shallower then, and it would be easier to get from India and the Asian mainland to the South Pacific. And I think, this just shows you again a kind of a montage of African faces from around the world. And here, I think I'm over my time, so let's leave some time for questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attention. Can we have the lights, please?
Question about a book called Adam the Altair Green, Children of the Sun. It talks about cataclysms.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've never read it. I know what you're talking about.
It puts into context how dinosaurs could have just left this earth. The changing of our, raciation, and the differences of our cultures from the environment. I just wanted to expound on that type of, something happened cosmologically.
Yeah. Well, some people call it punctated evolution, that, things seem to be moving along slowly over tens of thousands of millions of years. The dinosaurs were here for, 100 million years. All of a sudden, something, as you say, cataclysmic, whether it be a meteor or an earthquake or some kind of change in the Earth's magnetic sphere, will absolutely, completely alter the environment. Many will die and perish, but no species ever is, no life is not ever completely and absolutely destroyed. It just creates but what happens is when you get that kind of a cataclysm, you get very rapid development of new species. The reason why Caucasians evolved so quickly, relatively speaking, is because that environmental impact was so cataclysmic. This is what you find. You find marginal populations subject to a tremendous change of environment will develop into different types, variations or species very rapidly. And so some people call that punctated equilibrium. So that's, again, an operative scientific concept.
The other two quick comments were relating to, since we're all learning and learning every day, you mentioned that the Neanderthal man kind of reached a dead end.
Yes.
There's been research showing that their genes are still around when you, but I mean not our genes.
Okay, let me ask me that question, because that's a long, complicated answer. Well, let me just say this about Neanderthal. It used to be Europeans used to belittle and ridicule Neanderthal. Now they're resurrecting him. Why? Because mainly he's in Europe, and they're trying to say that, well, now, because, you know, they're using him as a weapon against the African origin of humanity. Say, well, really, here's Neanderthal, and really he was one of us. And so really, this is evidence that human beings might really have begun in Europe after all. But Neanderthal, he dies out. His ridges are different from ours. His frontal lobes are different from ours. He's a different species altogether. It's just another sort of, shall we say, clutching at straws, anything to beat back this idea that all of us, everybody on this planet, go back far enough and they got a black ancestor.
Okay, thank you. I'll save the other comments for later on.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the messenger for the message. I have a lot of interest in how Africans from their development of civilizations have gotten to the point where we are now. Can you comment on the whole thing about xenophobic and xenophilic, and why is it that we were the first people on the earth, the first civilizations and everything, how do we get to the condition that we are now?
Ooh. You know, complicated question. Some of it would be due, and I'm not going to answer all of it. I'm only going to deal with one part of it. Some of it would be due to what TransAtlantic refers to as a kind of natural regression that afflicts all peoples, all cultures, and all civilizations. Not all of it, but a good bit of it. However, only two people that I know of have tried to deal with this issue of essentially what happened in history. One of them, of course, is Chancellor Williams in Destruction of Black Civilization, and the other was TransAtlantic himself, looking at the motors of decadence, degeneration, and decline, such that Africa went into its dark age about 500 years ago. So some of it, Job talks about the sort of internal contradictions of any society that lay the seeds for its own destruction. What were those? Well, we could talk about that, but it requires a much more in-depth discussion that we really have time for here. But it's something, I'm not dismissing the question, because I think that it should be an entirely entirely concentrated field of research in and of itself. Only two people have really dealt with that, and that issue is long from being resolved or long from being dealt with. And I'd like to see more people who have that kind of scholarly bent go in and look at the causes of the decline and degeneration of Africa.
All praises be to the ancestors for its descendant that has brought us this message. My question simply is, at what place in human history, if at all, would you place the myth of Atlantis? Where on earth would you place it, if at all? And what did these people look like, if at all?
Yeah, again, let me not speak from the point of view of being authoritative. Let me just say Atlantis, some people say Atlantis is a myth. Some people say it represented a true happening. The truth always lies in the combination. Conceivably, it was both. Some people say Atlantis really represented the explosion of the island of Santorin off the coast, off near Crete, around 1450 BC, and that cataclysm affected the Mediterranean world, and that gave rise to the myth of Atlantis. Others say that Atlantis actually existed off the Atlantic Ocean, and Frobenius claimed to have been able to find evidence of this sort of prehistoric super civilization in West Africa, as an example. I just think that the issue is out. I think the thing is, you could argue it all day long. I do not dismiss it out of hand, but I just don't feel like any of us has enough information aside from what has mainly the argument, or mainly the evidence comes from Plato's Timaeus, in which he discusses what Solon found among the ancient Egyptian priests. So again, there's been a lot of verbiage about it, but again, the hard evidence is lacking. It has persisted